So what did we learn during the 3 years that it took to write Toy Story 3? Number one thing I learned was to be humble, because when we first started out, I thought I knew what good storytelling was, and that still didn't prevent me from getting lost and going in circles for 3 years. So for the introduction, the lesson learned is that your character's expectations for the future have to be certain, they have to be clear, and they have to be specific. And the more specific and vivid and sympathetic you can make those expectations, the stronger it'll be when your inciting incident comes along and disrupts them. And for your inciting incident, the lesson learned is that it should be a bolt from the blue. It should be unforeseen. It should be visceral. And oftentimes it's the best possible thing for your hero or the worst possible thing. And a lot of times you can't get there by plotting forward. You have to make the worst possible thing happen, and then you reverse engineer the story so that it makes narrative and emotional sense. So for the first act break, the lesson learned is that it's got to be the beginning of a quest. Your hero has to desperately want something, and we in the audience should be rooting for them to get what they're after. So your hero can't be passive. Your hero has to become active. You have to give them a sympathetic and compelling global goal, and then a specific and clearly defined plan, which is the first step to achieving that global goal. And the second act plan that your hero embarks upon has to be a clear, binary, black and white, pass-fail objective that your hero is either going to achieve or fail to achieve. And a lot of times your second act goal is relatively humble. It seems like it should be easy to achieve, and there is a ticking clock attached to it. And last but not least, you want visceral negative consequences if your hero fails to achieve that goal. Now, for the midpoint, the lesson learned was that every new direction in the story immediately requires new obstacles, and all midpoint reversals in your story should happen in as close proximity to each other as possible with no treading water. Now, for the second act break, the lesson learned is that you have to have a failure in your external set of stakes. You also have a failure in your internal set of stakes, but you also need a failure in your philosophical stakes. And then for the epiphany, the lesson learned is that many times you have a flip the binoculars moment. Your hero has to share your villain's point of view.
Adventure is out there!
And your villain's point of view has to seem like it's just irrefutable. Your villain can be a jerk, but he's also just saying hey, this is just the way the world works, grow up, and your hero doesn't have an answer to refute that. And the crucial thing here is that your villain is not wrong. Your villain is right. The way your villain looks at the world is right, it's self-evident, it's irrefutable. But your villain is looking at the world in a shallow, petty, and literal-minded way. He's looking at the world through the wrong end of the binoculars, just like your hero. So your hero's new truth is not that the bad guy is wrong, per se. Your hero's epiphany gives her a new way of looking at the world that is deeper, more generous, more poetic than the villain's view of the world. So for Toy Story 3, Andy's mom says, "I wish I could always be there with you." And Andy himself says, "You will be, Mom," and you're flipping what it means to be there for someone. In Up, for example, Carl Fredricksen goes through the whole movie thinking that he's a failure, right? Because he never gave his wife Ellie the life of adventure that he promised her when they were younger. And Carl goes through the whole movie thinking adventure is out there, and because he never left his hometown, he thinks that he never gave Ellie a real adventure. So the epiphany at the end of Up is that Carl goes through the adventure book, and he sees all the pictures from his life in the small town with Ellie. And when he gets to the last page, he sees that Ellie has written an inscription, "Thanks for the adventure, now go have another." And then you're flipping the meaning, because suddenly you're saying the greatest adventure is not out there. The greatest adventure is being in love and sharing your life with someone. In It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey goes through the whole movie feeling like he's a failure. He thinks I never moved out of this town. I just worked at my dad's little savings and loan, and maybe I helped a few people, but I'm not a rich man like Mr. Potter. Mr. Potter's the richest man in town, and I'm a failure, and now I'm worth more dead than alive. I'm just going to go kill myself. And at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey goes "I want to live again," and you're overturning the internal, the emotional stakes of the story. And then he goes home, and Donna Reed goes, George, it's a miracle." And they've raised $8,000, and you've overturned the external stakes of the story, right? But George Bailey still thinks he's a poor man, right? He still thinks that he's a failure. He still thinks that he lived his life in the wrong way, and he has nothing to show for it. And then you have George's war hero brother fly through the blizzard and come in and raise a toast and say to George Bailey, the richest man in town, and you're flipping the meaning of what it means to be rich. And in each case, you're redefining what it means to be there for someone, what it means to have an adventure, what it means to be rich. And in each case, the definition is reaching towards a deeper, more generous, more poetic way of looking at the world. So you're redefining life in ways that are deeper, more generous, and more poetic. And that's what storytelling is. The end. So that's a lecture that I gave at Pixar back in 2011. And obviously not every story has to work this way, right? Like you can write a story any way you want. Like every story has its own logic, its own problems and solutions. But I'll just tell you, man, good storytelling is really, really hard. It takes a long, long time. It involves a lot of trial and error. So if you're trying to write a script and you're walking in circles and you're going down blind alleys and you're beating your head against the floor, I hope some of these ideas will be helpful. So good luck and happy writing.